New Westminster Veterans Oral History Project. Today's date is November 7th, 2001. The interviewee is Miss Jean Dorgan from the Canadian Army Medical Corps. What is your full name?
Henrietta Jean Dorgan. I've always been called Jean.
Okay. Can you tell me your date and place of birth?
I was born in Westminster, November the 15th, 1910. My parents came from Ontario originally.
Okay. When did they come to New Westminster? Sorry.
In February of 1910.
Okay.
They came. They were married in Portland, Oregon, where both of them were working at the time. And my father was offered a position up here, and so they came up in February.
Okay, that's fine. So, could you tell me your current address?
Oh, well, it's Apartment 302, 1150, Quayside Drive, New Westminster,
Good.
BC.
And how did you get to this apartment? Give me your places of residences before this.
Well, I lived in New Westminster and worked as a public health nurse until 1942, when I enlisted in the Medical Corps as a nursing sister. And I never really came back to New Westminster after the war. I went to the University of Toronto for 2 years to get my master's degree. And then I came back and worked in New Westminster for about a year. But they were asking me to go back to Toronto, so that's where I went. And I taught at the School of Social Work there for about 9 years, I think it was. And in 1956, I went to Ottawa as a federal consultant in the mental health division.
Okay. And
from that date until 1975, when I retired, I stayed in Ottawa, but I moved from various departments, always involved in the rehabilitation of handicapped people, mentally or physically, and I ended up as head of the appeals section of the Canada Pension Plan, which had mostly to do with appeals regarding disability pensions.
Right. Yeah. And then
I took a tour on a freighter for 3 months and decided I would move back to British Columbia. So then I moved to a place in Richmond. I had a house in Ottawa, which I sold, and I bought a house in Richmond. And after in 1988, I guess it was, I moved over here to the Key, bought the place I'm in now. Okay. And the house I had in Richmond got too big for me.
Right.
So I've been here ever since.
Good, good. Okay. Now, on to the Armed Forces.
Mm-hmm.
What were you enrolled in? What branch of the Armed Forces?
The Army Medical Corps, and I had the rank of a lieutenant nursing sister. That was the rank for all nurses.
Okay. So you didn't change ranks then?
I didn't change ranks. I was an acting matron at the end of the war, which would have made me a captain, but it was never confirmed because the war in Europe was over. And they brought us home.
Well, that's okay then.
So, but your general duty nurse, whatever she was doing in the hospital, had the rank of lieutenant, first lieutenant.
First lieutenant.
Yeah, and you had to be a matron to be a captain of a 500-bed hospital, and a 15-bed hospital, 1,500-bed hospital. You'd be a major. They were very stingy with ranks.
Sounds like it.
I mean, yeah, for nursing sisters.
Right, right. Why was it called Nursing Sisters?
Well, that's traditional. You see, that was taken over from the British Army.
Okay.
We were never called sisters in Canada, but in England, the nursing sister is head of a ward. Not every nurse is a nursing sister. It's the head one.
Oh, I see.
And it's quite a prestige position in England. Yeah. But that doesn't obtain any longer. Nurses go into the regular army and officers training, and they may continue as nurses, but they take the training as officers, and in theory anyway, they could move to other parts of the army.
I see.
And they wear a different uniform.
Right.
Our uniform was, well, people thought it was quite glamorous, I think, but it wasn't too practical.
Well, since we're talking about it, why don't you describe the uniform?
Well, I'll bring a picture so you can just see what it looked like for him, with brass buttons going here, and a veil, and these stiff collars, and we have a belt, which I can show you in another picture, but it doesn't show in this picture. And that was the dress uniform for a party or reception. And we had a wool and we had a silk. Then we wore a similar blue cotton for duty, and we wore a white apron over it.
Right.
And we wore the veil. But when we got into a battle area, we wore a battle dress. Just that rough khaki uniform that everybody wore, men wore.
Right. Men wore.
It was battle dress. We wore the trousers and the battle dress.
Oh, you did?
Jacket, yeah. And we wore a khaki covering on our head, just a bandana.
And that was to identify you, I guess?
Well, it was just to keep our hair out of the way.
Yeah.
Instead of the veil, you know. Right. And we didn't have to polish any buttons. We didn't have any. And our rank was sewn on, you see. Mm-hmm. Here you see you had two. That picture was taken when I enlisted, so I was a second lieutenant for 6 months. So I only have one pip, as they call it there, but I had two later. But when you wore a battle dress, you had these sewn on, looked like pips, flannels.
Right.
I've got a picture of that too, I can show you. It was February, and we were up in a place called Avellino, shirt and skirt, and pants at night because of malaria. You know, we had to tuck our pants into our boots too, and have our sleeves right down to the wrist and so on. Yeah.
Okay. So, when did you enroll in the armed forces?
Oh, it was July 1942. The date, I think, was the 13th. 13th of September.
13th of September?
1942, yes. I was thinking of July, but that was when they called me.
And where did you enroll?
In Vancouver, at Little Mountain, which we now have the park, you know.
Yeah.
And that was a place where you took your oath and so on.
What was the response of your family and friends?
Well, I think they were glad for me because they knew I wanted to go. My father said, you know, her mother was always sorry she didn't get to the Second World War where friends did.
Yeah.
She said, so I'm glad Jean could go since she wants to go.
Right. When you enrolled, were you with friends? Did a bunch of you enroll, or?
No. They just called me to come in. Earlier, Eileen Williams and I, she was a local girl, and I've lost track of her. She may be dead. Her father was colonel of the Westminster Regiment. He was looking after enlistments and drills and things. He was a World War I vet.
Right.
And he put us through all the documents, so they were all over in Vancouver at the Vancouver Hotel, which was, the old Vancouver Hotel was where Eaton's is now, and it had closed down as a hotel and the Army took it over. But I reported there to the assistant district commander, I guess, and he said, oh, all your documents are here, he said. So they put me in a car and sent me up to Little Mountain, where they gave me all my information and told me where to report and when.
Right.
And gave me a ticket to go to Victoria.
Were you already working as a nurse by this time?
Yes, yeah. I happened to be, it was July, and I was on my holidays, and so I just had to tell them I was on my way, and so I didn't really give them very good notice, but when the Army calls, you don't argue.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I guess not, eh? So how many years of service did you complete?
Well, it would have been from from September till I was discharged in to the 13th of September, 1945. Right. And then I was on the active reserve for a number of years. They used to write and ask me if I would still be available to serve.
I see.
Well, I'd send the four back, but then eventually they stopped. I realized I was getting too old to be there, I guess.
When you heard that the war had begun between Canada, when Canada declared war, what sort of feelings were going through your head? What thoughts?
Well, you know, there'd been this feeling that this was going to happen. I mean, Hitler was just right out of control, and Chamberlain was not, he was placating him and placating him. And it just got too bad. So we weren't surprised. And when I had graduated, the Red Cross had a form they would give to graduating nurses asking if they would be willing to serve in war or disaster relief. And if you were interested, you could sign this form, which I did. So I thought, well, the war is on, and I signed this thing, so I guess I'll be in pretty soon. And, of course, our parents were upset, terribly upset, because they remembered World War I and how people were dying, all the young people. And I remember we had a place at Boundary Bay on the American side, our summer place, and that's where we were when war was declared. It was a weekend. And Mrs. Whalen, who was an American, Whalen's owned the place, they had homesteaded the property there, was crying. She had a daughter and son who were very close to my brother and me, and she said, "Oh, you'll all be going," and so on.
Right, right.
Of course, the Americans weren't in then, but
Right.
she knew they would be.
Oh, what a memory.
Mm-hmm. So, but I just took it for granted that I would be going, and I was kind of excited about the whole thing.
Yeah.
But really what happened was we spent about 2 years going to meetings and setting up aid posts, and we were later afraid of the Japanese coming out of the coast. And I said to someone that I was glad to get in the army and know what I was doing, because nobody seemed to know what they were doing. Oh, the civilians were trying to do all kinds of things, but didn't know quite what to do.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was one big hospital mobilized in Vancouver, and I tried to get into that one, but I didn't make it.
Right, right.
I was a public health nurse to begin with, and they were taking hospital nurses.
Oh, I see. Right, right.
Well, I mean, it didn't put me in the best position.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So when you did get enlisted,
Mm-hmm.
What was the first thing that happened? What sort of training did you receive?
Well, I was sent to Victoria,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a hospital there. The Victoria Military Hospital was set up in a high school that they'd taken over. And we were given, I just forget now, but basic information for officers and the ranks, the various ranks. And we had a course in map reading, I remember.
Map reading?
I did quite well at it, but I couldn't tell you what good north was now. And we had to write an exam before we could get our second PEP, the full lieutenant.
Right.
Which really, I forget what was in it. It wasn't very hard anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And nurses didn't drill.
No.
And it was not traditional. We didn't salute. We said good morning. If someone saluted us, we acknowledged it with a good morning or good afternoon. Right. And it was just traditional. The Canadian nurses didn't. And in some sense, we weren't terribly military, but we were. We knew how to wear our uniforms and how to behave.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get from Victoria to Halifax, I guess?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I had to go up to Vernon. I went into the Army in September. September, yeah. And so in February, they moved me up to Vernon, which was a big military camp there. And all the men out in huts, and we were nursing men in huts. And so at night, it was quite cold at that time of the year, icy underground. So if you were a night nurse, you were going around with a flashlight from hut to hut,
No kidding. So the hospital was made of huts, really?
Yeah, at first. They did build a hospital just before I left, but we mostly nursed in huts. And you'd make your rounds of the ward, you see.
So really your active service started right away?
Oh, yes,
yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
And then when we went to... we were shipped back to Windsor, and I'm going to get that date. September 1943, I was assigned to number 3 military hospital.
And that was in Windsor? Or?
Well, no, it was overseas, but it was mobilized in Windsor.
Oh, I see.
And what we did, we got on the train, and there were 2 nurses from BC. I joined up with a girl that I had never seen before, and she's in there. And in Alberta, we picked up 2 more nurses, and we picked this is how we got our staff.
Wow.
2 nurses from each province as we went along, and 2 medical officers as well. And we were put up, the men in Windsor, Ontario, this was, they almost made a mistake. They had me posted, or they sent me to Windsor, Nova Scotia.
No kidding.
I was supposed to be in Windsor, Ontario, which they picked up in time. And the nurses stayed in a hotel, and the men stayed in the barracks there. And we would meet every day and do a little bit of drilling and get to know each other. The colonel and the matron are there, which we didn't know them before.
What was the drilling like?
Just marching up and down, you know. Left, right. We weren't very good at it.
What would have been an average day of training?
I'm trying to think, you know. I don't think we did much in Windsor.
Yeah.
I think we just made sure we had all our equipment, you know, and knew what we were to do. And nobody told us where we were going, but of course we knew if we were in in Ontario that we must be on our way to England.
Right.
And so we, I think the date, what date we got? We left Halifax for England on the 13th of September.
What was that like?
1943. And we marched down this, I had aunts there and uncles and cousins, and I couldn't let any of them know where I was or where I was going.
In Halifax?
Yeah, no, this was still in Windsor.
Oh, I see.
And so we started out from Windsor, I don't know what, I know we left Halifax on the 13th of September, so it must have been about 2 days before that we left Windsor. And we marched that day to the train, and I had ordered a new suit, which didn't come until the day before we left, and we were all packed, and so we were carrying our greatcoats, and I didn't know what to do with this suit, so I put it inside the greatcoat. It must have looked pretty awful when we were prancing down to the train. And when we got on the train, it was very interesting because we didn't know all these other hospitals were getting on, you see. So we'd stop at all these Ontario towns and pick up another train, another car.
Oh, okay.
And someone would come along and say, well, number 13's on, number 5's on, number this is on. And you weren't supposed to leave your car, but pretty soon someone would be poking at your berth and in the Pullman, you know, what we were in, and saying, hey, you know, Dr. Dorgan, how did you know? So you knew all your friends were in these various hospitals.
Oh, I see.
And when we got to Halifax, the train pulled right up to the side of the ship. There were tracks right on the dock, you know. And I knew then it had to be the Queen Elizabeth because we couldn't see it. You know, it's so big that we were so close we couldn't see it. And they marched us right up the gangplank.
Really? You went straight from Windsor right into Halifax?
Yeah. Right. And we were 3 days on that ship at docked while they loaded, and that tramping never stopped. Tramp, the gangplank. These were men, of course, I think. And I think the nurses all went on first, but I wouldn't be sure about that. And there were, I don't know how many of us there were in the deluxe cabin. They stripped it and put these tier bunks in. And there was a big bathroom, all tile, and we'd smoke in there. We weren't supposed to smoke anywhere on the ship, but we smoked in there.
Sure, everybody was.
Yeah, I smoked. But we had 2 meals a day. There was lots of food, and you could bring a sandwich or something from the dining room, but they couldn't. There were so many of us, they couldn't put us all in the dining room 3 times a day. So our meals were 7:30 and 4:30, I think it was.
So how long did the trip overtake?
I think it was 3.5 days.
And what was that like? What was the experience?
Well, it was, a lot of the time we were in our cabins. We weren't allowed to go out, and the whole ship was stripped of furniture. But once in a while they let us out to the lounge, which is a great big lounge, with no furniture, but it was carpeted from wall to wall, and we just sat on the floor and played cards or something. Somebody usually had an old rubby pack of cards, and we'd sit on the floor and play. And then they'd order us back again. And you had to have your life preserver with you all the time.
Well, I guess there was the risk of
attack. If you were moving from your cabin to the dining room, and I remember this one day I forgot it, and there were 2 soldiers at the head of the stairs. You know, it was a gorgeous ship, you know, it was a great, beautiful staircase, and they just, these guns across my chest. I was really shocked. I thought, get back and get your life jacket.
Wow. So when you got to England, where were you first stationed?
Well, we landed at Gurrick in Scotland, and we took the train down, and we'd been 3 days pretty uncomfortable, so most of us had pretty bad colds. And I think one of the doctors said that he was pretty sure I had bronchitis, only he didn't have his x-ray machine to make sure. Anyway, we went to a place called Dorgan, and we had 3, it was an estate with 3 big houses on it. One belonged to Malcolm Campbell, the racing driver, and the other 2, I don't know who owned them, but the officers had one, and the nursing sisters had the other one. And the men, there were all kinds of huts out in the grounds for the men, and enlisted men, and there were trenches, tank traps, they called them, you know, and all through this property. And we were blacked out every night, and of course, we always said we were supposed to have a flashlight at night when we were out, but we'd forget to take it out when we were out in the daytime, and we came back in the dark. It was terrible to find your house, because there just was no light, you see. They wouldn't let you have any daylight or anything. So we were supposed just to be there, I don't know, till we went somewhere else, I guess. But we weren't taking patients. And then the matron came to me and said, "You have a university degree?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I wonder if you'd catalog these instruments." Well, they are good instruments that we brought with us had just disappeared. And this was typical of the Army. Somebody more sophisticated would grab your good stuff, you know, and you'd be left with something less good. And these were instruments that were not what we were used to. And so she said, "Would you just catalog them according to the closest name that you can find, you know?" So I did. And it was a weird set because they had 24 pairs of bandage scissors and one needle driver. You know, the needle driver is what the doctor uses to hold the needle when he's stitching. And here we were in a surgical unit. One needle driver, you know, and we were supposed to have 3 teams working. And, you know, these have to be sterilized and everything. And they were awfully poor instruments, too. They rusted and they were terribly hard to sterilize. But in the middle of this, they had sent 4 girls off to London. They were going to be the OR nurses, and they had special training, and they were going for more special training. And my friend Jean and I were in here just sort of setting up the instruments and that sort of thing. And suddenly they were bringing in patients. So we were OR nurses all of a sudden. And
that wasn't even in London.
No, this was in Dorgan.
Right,
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
No, there wasn't. Most of the hospitals were scattered around, you know.
And so you actually end up working on patients for...
Yeah, and in camp cots. And I thought, well, this is funny because there were a lot of base British and Canadian hospitals around us. Why are we looking after people on camp cots? It's not very comfortable. But of course, there were schemes, you know. They were getting us ready for where we were going. But nobody told us much. And Jean and I suddenly just had to take over this OR and do what we could. And we had to improvise gowns and everything because, you know, OR gowns and caps, because none of our stuff had come.
That was a good exercise.
Oh, boy. And so then, by Christmas, it was just I think we spent Christmas in Dorgan, and they brought us our battle dress, and so we knew then we were going. So we had boots, high-laced boots, and these pants and battle dress jacket, and khaki shirts, and long woolen underwear, and nothing fit, you know.
They're all for men, I guess.
Well, no, they were supposed to be for women, but it seemed as though what you could do was either take something that was too big or too small, you know, and in the shoes, or the boots as little as possible. I hated them. And then we were moved over to number 2 General, which was a big base hospital. And let's see. I guess I didn't write that down. We stayed at this hospital for a couple of days, and then we were loaded onto trains, and we went to the Mersey.
Right.
That's where we embarked, and it was very interesting because, you know, we come over on the Queen Elizabeth, which was such a fast ship, and now we were going on convoy, and we were on our little ship. It was a very small ship called the Lancashire, which had belonged to the army, used to take troops out to India. And all of a sudden, just on cue, over the horizon, all came these ships. Never seen anything like it. All on cue. And there we were in the middle of this thing. But we weren't in the middle of it for long because our ship was so slow that we were always getting lost. We were coming back together, you know, and they were, of course, we were patrolled by corvettes that were depth charging all the time because we were, I don't know whether there were as many submarines after us as sounded, but the ship every once in a while would take a bounce because when they sent these depth charges down, they'd be quite considerable distance away, but you'd feel it in the bottom of the ship.
So that was number 3, right?
That was number 3, and I guess we were the only hospital on that ship.
Right.
And we were there with, there were some Scots guards and Coldstream guards and Welsh guards, all British regiments. So we were the only women on.
And the only Canadians.
Yes. And so it took us about 2 weeks to get to Naples. Because, the ships zigzagged all over the place to escape being torpedoed. And I don't know, as we were approaching the Mediterranean, we got this message on the radio from the Germans that the 2 ships that left you off the Azores, we've sunk both. And could have been just harassment, but
propaganda.
And we were the first convoy to get through Gibraltar without being torpedoed, or attacked. So we were all sort of on alert. But the nurses were sent down underneath off deck, so we wouldn't have had much of a chance.
No kidding.
No.
So you got to Naples.
Yeah.
What was it like?
Naples was interesting, but pretty awful looking. The harbor had been completely shot up, and there were no real wharves or docks, nothing. And when we went ashore, we went on gangplanks that were laid over the hulls of sunken ships that were right in the harbor. So that was our gangway.
And did you set up hospital right there?
No, we went to a place called Avellino, and that was 60 kilometers about from, it was east and a bit north of Naples, as I recall, a town called Avellino. And it was higher. We were in a convent. They set us up in this convent. The nuns had gone somewhere, I don't know, but they gave us the building. And it was just at the foot of Monte Vergine, which it was a small mountain, whatever, but it had the second oldest monastery in Italy. Casino was the oldest one, and Monte Vergine was the second one.
Right.
And we could walk up there. It wasn't a hard walk. And the monks were up there on the hill, and they were there in the winter, and in the summer they came down on the mainland. They had a monastery right near our convent, and that's where they grew their vegetables and things, and they made wine, but they were Benedictine monks, but they made chartreuse liqueur. And let's see, we were there in Avellino taking patients, medical patients, and surgical, and we had to set up a...
And these are soldiers that you were taking?
Yeah, but they weren't battle injuries necessarily. They were all, there was a big manning depot in Avellino.
I see.
And we went down to this hotel. It was called the Transit Hotel, where the officers could stay on their way up to the front. And we were often invited down there to dance or to eat or whatever.
Nice. Well, tell me about the social life there.
Well, the social life was, it was good, but sometimes, then you'd be very busy and you wouldn't have any social life much. But of course, we were women, and we weren't there weren't too many of us, and certainly not Canadians, so there were lots of Canadian soldiers wanting to take us wherever they could. There was, mostly we just go down to the transit hotel and dance.
Yeah.
And they would drink, or it was spumante, which is a kind of a champagne, poor man's champagne. But this stuff was awful. I don't know who made it or how quickly they made it. But when they would take the cork out, it would go all over the place, so you'd end up with about that much in the bottle, and the floors would be awash with this stuff. But we weren't there very long, but the first, I met a man there, an officer, who remained a good friend the whole war, the whole time of the war, and it was a very weird sort of a date that I was on, because the matron came along and said I wasn't on duty, and she said, there are 2 young officers here that are loose ends, are on their way back to England, and they wondered if 2 nurses would have dinner with them. And I wasn't keen on this. I never liked blind dates, but she was kind of sympathetic and persuasive. And so we went with them, and it was a very odd sort of date. And finally this Alan that I met later came over and asked me to dance, and we had quite a nice time, but these other 2 weren't dancing, and they were acting rather odd. And it turned out that they were on the loose. One of them had been wounded, lost one eye, and he was being shipped back to England. He didn't want to go. He wanted to stay with his regiment, and they didn't want to jail him, confine him to barracks. So he got away a couple of times. So eventually they just had to find him. But we didn't know this, of course. Someone told us the story later.
Wow.
And we never had any more weird dates like that. But there was one funny thing happened that we didn't have any equipment, no sheets, no gowns for the patients, nothing, because they were taking all the ammunition and guns off the ships for the 3rd attack on Casino. And so we had to make do with whatever we could find. But we had inherited one patient who the previous hospital had moved out. They'd shipped their patients elsewhere. But they left this one man by the name of Acker, and because he was too ill to move. And he had typhoid. He'd been very ill, and typhoid can affect the brain, the continuing long temperature. So he was sort of childlike, and he was sitting up in bed with a happy smile, It was a case of now trying to feed him up and get him so he'd be strong enough to be sent back to England. But he had terrible night sweats. And the nurse that was on duty with him, they just had 2 nurses on with him day and night, didn't have a gown. We had a sort of a Mother Hubbard blue gown that we could put on for the OR and things like that. You could protect your clothes, and it was more sanitary. And so I said, well, you can have mine, Ruth. So I gave her my wraparound, or whatever you call it. And she went off with it, and we took the sheets off our beds, because most of us had a pair of sheets with our sleeping bag.
Right.
And in the morning came down to breakfast, and Ruth came down and she said, "You'll die when you see Acker." She had come down to get all our sheets and everything because she had to keep changing his bed. And here, when I went on the ward, here was Acker sitting up in bed in my blue wrapper. It was the last thing she had to put on him, so that's what he had. But we started taking patients after that.
So when did you actually move into working on soldiers?
Well, let me see. I want to get some dates here. May the 11th, we were up under canvas on the highway, getting ready for the attack on Casino. And that was 13 kilometers from Casino. And that was, they were going after they were going to try again to wipe out the Germans. It was a series of hills, you see. The Germans would go from one hill to another, all these hill towns. And so that's the date we were there. And we were on highway number 6, about 13 kilometers from Casino. And we were one of a number of medical units strung along the highway, preparing for the attack on Casino and the Gustav line, which came next. The Gustav line was a line thought to be fortifications. The Allies didn't know. They didn't have good intelligence on it. They didn't know whether it was going to be a terrible battle or easy. Turned out not to be too bad.
So, just why don't you explain to me how the hospitals worked? Because you mentioned before they leapfrogged.
Yeah.
And then after that, just quickly, and then after that, describe to me what a hospital would have been like.
Well, we were, as I say, 13 miles from Casino. And there were 2 other casualty clearing units. They would be 500 beds. And no, they were 150 beds and we were 200 beds. Right. Because we took medical patients when the Army was inactive. But the casualty clearing, the 150s, they would be on rest. I'm not just sure why. But I'm not sure where each of them went. But I know that when the attack on Casino was over, and we began, clear up things, and the Army was moving up to the Gustav line, we moved up to a place called Ferentino. We were supposed to be in. But when we got to Ferentino, they told us to go on. They wanted us to take a place in Abilene, in Anagni, a town called Anagni. And it's a very historic old town, and there was a school there built by Mussolini for the sons of officers, and it was built around an old Christian church dating from the 12th century. And the place was huge. And we landed there. We had left early in the morning in a convoy, which moves very slowly. And we missed the food train and everything else because they had to come back and get us. They hadn't sent enough vehicles for it. And so we got to Anagni and to this big convent or school around 10 o'clock at night. And the officers met us at the door and said, "Well, we're just setting up a regimental aid post here." We said, "Well, we're here with the casualty clearing So the Army moved quickly at that point, and they saw this big building, and the Canadians wanted to grab it, you see. So that's why they moved us up to be there. We were far too small to fill the place.
Right.
And then we didn't move again for a while. They moved. The Army withdrew, and they left us there.
Right.
Under, I guess we were too small to move or something. They left us there under a British control or supervision. It wasn't a very happy time. Does that give you any idea?
That goes a bit.
We just knew that we were ahead of these people sometimes and behind them another.
No, that's fine. And so, what can you describe to me what your hospital would have consisted of? You said it was 150 beds. So, what was your duties, say?
Well, we all had wards to look after, but what you did, of course, was separate the patients from the seriously wounded. You see, you'd have 2 wards of chest wounds and abdominal wounds and maybe amputations, and that's where the nurses would be with orderlies. And of course the orderlies were not, some of them had been trained in hospitals, but a lot of them weren't. They were just soldiers that were seconded. And so you had all these patients to look after, as in any hospital. They had to be bathed and dressings done, they're fed and medication, and it was, you see, it was at Casino that we first got penicillin. So the penicillin was then routine every 3 hours, anybody who was wounded. That saved a lot of lives.
Just from an infection.
Yeah, but you could, it was new and it was painful, and as I say, it was every 3 hours, and so it was hard on the patients, but of course it saved all these infections we might have had. So, in the middle of all this, of course, if there was an attack, you see, if you knew, if an attack was going in, you knew pretty well, because you'd be clearing out all, you'd be told to clear out all your patients, and you might be looking after these people, for instance, wounds and various kind of wounds, and all of a sudden they'd be moved out by an ambulance train, moved down to the base hospitals at Perugia and Naples, places like that. And these would be big 1,500 bed hospitals.
Right.
And then there were hospital ships to take them back to England too, but depending on the situation. But we were left up here at Anagni under the British, and we were taking British patients. These were just medical cases by then. And it wasn't nice at all, because the British had an idea that we were very free and easy and that anything went. Well, we were not stiff and miserable with our patients, but nobody took advantage of that. Nobody was rude or cheeky, and they knew you were an officer and they weren't, and there was a line drawn there. But the British were just awful. They were insolent, and they wouldn't do anything that they were supposed to. They were supposed to make their beds and carry trays and do things if they weren't badly wounded, you see. They were just very unpleasant. And they just didn't understand it all. But this great hospital, you see, we only filled a few rooms of it. And the nuns were there who had done the housekeeping for this school. And we looked after them, we fed them, they had no one to look after them. They had quarters somewhere in the building, and they did things for us. They did ironing and mending and things. So, you see, there were two kinds of work. One, when you were just looking after these patients that were coming in on the assembly line, and then there'd be a breather, and you'd have people that were coming in with, one time when we were at Rimini, which was the last place, I guess, we were in Italy, we were getting all diphtherias. And now these men had all been inoculated, but they still, some of them had positive throat. So we were always busy, but then when all of a sudden they cleared out all these patients in Rimini and sent us back to Avellino.
Right.
And then we went north again. You know,
Right.
it was,
Can you just describe to me when there was an attack on? You said you'd clear out the hospital, and then you mentioned something about an assembly line. Tell me, would that be like any time during the day? And then just describe to me what this assembly line meant.
Well, as long, you see, no soldier was supposed to go past the casualty clearing station without being checked by a medical man and nurses and whatever dressings he needed and so on. And some went. There would be a team of surgeons. We had two teams, and also when we had at Casino, we had some volunteer South Africans from the Air Force who came over because they said, we don't have anything to do because when our men are shot down, they're gone, you know. So these teams would be working, and in theory, one would work and one would rest, but usually they'd work all the time.
Right.
And they'd be the chief medical officer, and he'd be seeing all of these stretchers that would come in the door.
Are these straight from the front lines?
Yeah, they would go, they'd get whatever, maybe dressings, you know, emergency. Every man carried a dressing that he could clamp onto a bleeding wound. If he couldn't do it, maybe his pals could. He'd be put on a stretcher. You see, there'd be an ambulance train there, and they'd put them right onto the ambulances and bring them in to us. And at one point, it took just 15 minutes to get a man from the regimental aid post to a casualty clearing. And of those that we got, a very low percentage died, hardly any. And when someone did die, we were really quite devastated because you can't be professionally objective about your brothers and sisters, you know. The Army is different. You can do that in a hospital, but in a civilian, but not in the Army. But so I'd be doing all kinds of things. I'd be checking all the, we had this line of stretchers. I'd be getting woolens from the Red Cross department cupboard to dress them up with helmets and scarves and socks, because the clothes would be shot off them or messy, and blankets, and looking at their charts, which would be tied to their ankles, and to see what kind of medication they'd had.
In the ambulance, or?
And this would be still on the stretcher.
Right.
And some wouldn't be taken off the stretchers. Others would be taken off and put in one of our beds. And it would be looked after.
If
they couldn't go on, if they felt, you know, bad abdominal wound or something, they might. But the rest we just bundle them up and I give them a shot of morphine hoped they'd sleep until they got to the base hospital, because it would be such a rough ride. You know, Army vehicles, they didn't seem to have any springs, and the roads were all shot up. It was pretty, and someone said to me one day, nurses sometimes are quite, they wait for orders, you know. They don't like to take responsibility for decisions that they may have to answer for later. And somebody said to me, "You've given all this morphine without any orders." And I said, "Well, where am I going to get the orders?"
Yeah.
I said, "Well, you know, it's supposed to be ordered by a doctor." I said, "The doctors are in the OR. They don't want to be bothered with me."
Right.
And I said, "Do you think they're going to court-martial me because I use my head?" So,
definitely the medical corps was a different breed. Right?
Yeah, we were different.
Yeah.
And but nurses, as a rule, you must get an order from a doctor for whatever you do. And that's fine. That's the way it should be. But in a situation like that, I wasn't going to leave men in pain for hours. And sometimes pain can cause people shock, you know.
Yeah.
But actually, soldiers needed very little medication. They were sort of so tired and so glad to get into a hospital bed.
Right. And so would there be people coming in where you would have to administer, you know, start stitching people up and things?
We didn't.
Did the doctors?
And the doctors would do that.
Yeah.
Yes. No, we didn't do that.
But still in the casualty clearing.
In the clearing, yeah.
They would actually do that.
There'd be a medical officer, the chief medical officer, checking. He wouldn't be a surgeon, probably. He'd be checking each of them to make sure that this man isn't bleeding so badly that he's got to, you know. And so they'd be taken off the stretcher and sent. And then they'd be in another line for the OR. And it would just be like, you've seen the thing in MASH, that's about what it looked like. You know, we had to set up wherever we were. And then all of a sudden, you know, that battle would be over, and they, you know, what they called was withdrawing for regrouping and reinforcements, which they really got. But then we'd sort of pull ourselves together and start looking after bed pays. The first thing you knew, they'd be sending you medical cases, because men got pneumonia, and they got, as I say, we had a bout of diphtheria, or they got tonsillitis. And we did minor surgery, too, sometimes of an appendectomy, you know, someone would need. You didn't want, it wasn't a battle wound, but does that give you more of an idea?
That gives me a great idea. Yeah. And I'm just going to move on to just briefly, you were in Italy. Did you go to any other countries while you were there?
Yes, we went. When the war was over in Italy, we were taken up by the 21st Army Group. Our hospital was. And we were shipped to Holland.
Right.
We were taken down by train, ambulance train, to Naples, and we took a ferry from Naples over to Marseille, and we stayed in Marseille just in shacks around near an American hospital, but we weren't working as nurses then. And then they flew us up to Belgium, and we had leave in England and got some clothes because we didn't have anything. None of our clothes came with us. And then we flew over to Holland, and we went first to a town called Tilburg.
Right.
And we nursed there, and that was another convent. I guess they were always picking on the convents. And from there we went to Utrecht, and the British came and we just got the building cleaned up, and the British came and said we couldn't have that building and booted us out. We really didn't like the British much, you know. I don't know whether you should put that in. But then we went on to, let's see, Nijmegen. We went to Nijmegen after that. Now, and Nijmegen was really the wind down of the war in Europe. And the last patients we had, we were getting all kinds of battle casualties first. Then VE Day came, and we got soldiers. The Germans just left the prisoners of war camp. The men just walked out of wherever they were, and they reported to whatever unit was near, and we got quite a lot of soldiers who had bad sores from malnutrition, you know, and so on, but they were alive, and they came in, and we looked after them.